Governor Braun now has full control over who will be on the Indiana University Board of Trustees. Previously, the Alumni Association voted on 3 of the 9 seats. IT Mate's Cody Fisher is working to get to the bottom of who is truly behind this move.
An IU law professor who's an alumni and has been associated with the university for 45 years has a theory about where this move really came from and why the legislature handled it in this way.
Of course, this is bad government practice. It's like back to the bad old smoke-filled room days where there was no transparency.
That exact issue was brought up last night by State Representative Matt Pierce from Bloomington.
Who exactly requested this provision to be in the bill? Whose idea was it?
There was some discussion among several people, but the key is we want to treat IU the same as other universities. The only one that requires an election. They're the outlier.
Pierce quickly pointed out that is not the case.
Purdue alumni get to choose their 3 alumni representatives, and they get to decide for themselves how they select them. So why aren't we having some changes there?
Because the only one required is in terms of an election to encode. IU is an outlier in that regard.
Well, isn't this an election if you're going to get all the Purdue Alumni Association together? And in a manner that they prescribe, they're going to select someone. Isn't that an election?
That's a type of election.
If the legislature were seriously concerned about, like, alumni trustees just shouldn't properly play a role, they would have done it to the other universities. Purdue, Indiana State, they have alumni trustees. This singled out IU.
IU law professor Steve Sanders says evidence points to this move coming from within the university itself, from the top. President Pamela Whitten.
I'm not claiming to have any direct evidence. I don't have tape recordings of phone calls that she was making about this, but I've talked to smart people and people who are plugged in, and I've looked at the circumstantial evidence, and that leads me to conclude that this was her idea.
He says President Whitten has never liked the idea of the Alumni Association having control over 3 of the Board of Trustees seats and does not like that alumni appointees have been vocally against some university decisions, which is why Sanders says the evidence points to Whitten going to the legislature.
My theory is that they got their marching orders from the president, and so it was best for everybody concerned that this be done at the last minute under cover of night so that the university wouldn't have to answer awkward questions, wouldn't have to go on the record.
As for the impact on the university, Sanders says it depends on who Governor Braun appoints to the board.
If it's an ideological edge, if they start getting involved in questions like what books and readings are faculty members assigning for their classes, I think we'd have a serious crisis on our hands of academic freedom.
On the flip side,
if that means they're going to see themselves as having more independence from the president and are going to actually act like they're the president's boss rather than the president being their boss, which is the way the current Board of Trustees behaves, that might not necessarily be a bad thing.
I reached out to the university multiple times to get a comment for this story. I did not get a response. For IT Mate, I'm Cody Fisher. For Wish TV, wishtv.com.
Well, Indiana's best political team says it's not unusual to see major changes like what we saw with the IU Board of Trustees thrown in at the last minute. That drove our discussion for this week's episode of All Indiana Politics.
This always happens every single cycle. There's always something that gets thrown in. And I think when you look at some of the bills that have happened during the session and when you look at some of the things that have happened at IU, we had seen that there was an issue where I believe the administration and the trustees were clashing, specifically when it came around the protests that were happening in Dunn Meadow and how those protests were handled. So I'm not surprised to see this type of action taken by the General Assembly.
Laura, why does it matter who names the IU trustees?
Well, I think when you go back to the process and you go back to the sort of the big picture about this, you do have to look at IU as one of the most, I would say, one of the major institutions in this country or in the state and even in the country. It's an economic engine. It's a driver for education and for growth, and particularly for our state's economy, right? And when you look at the people who have graduated from the school, you've got some, it gives them a voice in the university. I can't think of a university that does not have alumni representatives on it. And I think by doing it this way, I mean, you can say that this happens every session and something slides under the cover of darkness. But by doing it this way, without public debate, without public discussion, and something on this that's so consequential, particularly because of the economic impact that IU has, frankly, on the state of Indiana, when you do something that is of this great of a consequence, it doesn't look good for the supermajority. It doesn't look good for the governor. And it makes, I think it puts forth a perception that when the process is not followed, there's something wrong about it.
And you can see much more of our discussion this weekend on All Indiana Politics. It airs at 9:30 Sunday morning exclusively here on WISH TV.